Hi, I'm M.
And my name is Bea.
And this is
Fangirls Anonymous. A quick warning, this podcast is not for kids.
We get into some pretty explicit stuff.
But if you're still with us and into that, welcome.
Hello!
Hi! Hi!
We have a new voice today. Her name is Misssampo.
Yeah, she's our very first guest and we're super excited to have her.
I'm very excited to be here. Hi, everyone.
So, today we are going to be talking to Misssampo about asexuality in fandom. You have a personal knowledge about this, right? Not to out you or anything.
No, this is the whole point of this. I do. I am asexual and also aromantic. I have been interested in fan culture for a long time as a lurker and a complete ghost. And, I'm here to give my thoughts on asexuality as someone who's in there and talk about fandom stuff because it's Pride. At least when we're recording this, so.
Yeah, we're recording this in June. If the people who are listening don't know what Pride Month is, which I highly doubt.
Google.
Okay. This is our first guest. You're our first guest ever.
Oh, so excited.
All right, now that we have claimed our excitement to everybody in the world, do you want to ask the first question, Em?
Yes, definitely. So I was wondering how your experience as an asexual person has been in the fandom community as a whole.
All right, so as I mentioned earlier, I am a complete lurker. Internet people scare me. And I never openly talk to people that I don't already know on the internet. So a lot of the stuff I see are things I'm kind of witnessing from the bushes of fan communities. But as someone who knew they were asexual right around my kind of mid-teenage years, and that's when I really got into things like Tumblr, and I was, a teenager in the Super Hulock years, witnessing all that happen, it was interesting. Because at first it was very exciting because I would see some people say, oh, asexuality, I think Sherlock's asexual, and oh, Castiel, and, getting very excited of, oh, people talk about the thing that I am. Oh, it's so wonderful and thrilling. And then slowly getting a little sadder as ace discourse really got reared up and people got very mean, very toxic, and I just kind of inched backwards further and further going, oh no, this isn't very nice and fun. So it's been quite an up and down, and nowadays things are very settled. Tumblr has become the graveyard of its former self, and I think it's much happier that way. And people are just very chill of, yeah, asexuality is a thing, ace discourse is very stupid and bad, and we're here to chill and have a good time. So it's been a roller coaster of positivity, toxicity, and now just acceptance.
Sounds like the grief process.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry that that's been such a fucked up situation for you online regarding your identity.
I mean, not to completely gloss over it, but it really isn't that unusual. Every community, especially under the queer umbrella or the LGBT plus umbrella, has their own unique way where things just get toxic and you need to kind of work it out. From ace discourse, from, current issues on trans rights, trans issues, and dealing with all these different people that are trying to push and pull trans people in all these different directions, from the discourse about bisexuality and polyamory and pansexuality, this whole thing about people not really having the vocabulary about trans rights and kind of stumbling into some weird instances of, bisexuals only love two people, but pansexuals love everyone, with the implicit, kind of implying that bisexual people couldn't love trans people. And, no one was trying to be malicious. It's just the vocabulary wasn't there, and it was so easy to just spin out of control with everyone kind of yelling in the same symposium. So It does just kind of happen, and as someone who's much more of an adult looking back on it, it very much felt like it was a bunch of teenagers, very young people. Even though people of all ages were in this, the atmosphere was very youthful. And it feels like as it gets older and, Tumblr settles into its graveyard, it really just kind of matures, or at least the immature people have moved on to Twitter to yell and be wrong over there.
Do you really consider Tumblr a graveyard?
More of just, it's a lot quieter and people move a lot slower through it, so it feels ghostly, but I'm sure it's just the parts that I sit in that feel like that. Because again, total lurker.
Maybe a better way to put it is it has entered a new season of its life.
Oh, it has.
Oh, God.
Whatever that season may be.
You sound like you're talking about a dying dog.
Maybe not that, but maybe like the old lady that has stopped trying to harass her neighbors and is now just rocking ominously in her rocking chair on the deck, staring at everyone, unblinking. That's what Tumblr is.
So you touched on this for sure, but when you are interacting with fandom, you mentioned these couple of fandoms specifically, but do you actually get to see a whole lot of fandoms that have ace people at all?
Actually, that's real interesting because recently I would say yes to the millionth degree, because the Magnus Archives has a canonically asexual main character, and it's magical and wonderful, and I'm full of love and rainbows for it. But before the Magnus times, going backwards, asexuality was kind of like queer characters in all stripes of. Most of it was headcanon and conjecture and subtext, much like subtext between, how two men look at each other, like Will Graham and Hannibal Lecter, or Sherlock and John, or even Dean and Castiel. Those people that saw these deep, romantic emotions in there, other people could also say, I actually think they're like this, where this doesn't feel sexual to me. It feels different. How they interact with people reminds me of myself or this person I know. And that makes me think of them as asexual. So canonical stuff, no, that is still rare as pearls in a pig trough. But in terms of interpretations, those have always been sprinkled in there, just as a general rule, because, even though we're a very small population, I believe 1% of the world's population is the entire citizenry of Canada. So it's small comparatively speaking, but still, for every Canadian that is on Tumblr, they could also be asexual. And that would give you a good idea of how many are there.
It's nice, I think, to put it back in perspective, because it's saying 1%, you're thinking, oh, that's 1 in 100 people, and then you're thinking like a huge room with tons and tons of people. 100 people isn't actually that many people. So it's nice to put it back in perspective that, no, actually 1% is a ton of people that you could interact with and who care about this representation.
And, are very different. There are some things that feel kind of unifying, just like in every community. We have our in-jokes and stuff, but people are very different. Some people are mean, some people are nice, some people are loud about this, some people are not. Some people have lots of headcanons, some people just don't talk about them. So it's just as varied. It's just harder to get a good sample size because we're more dispersed amongst this pond.
Yeah. Do you find that there are a lot of like headcanon ships, or like where one person is asexual? Do you find that you can find that in fandom, basically, where like it's not in canon like the Magnus Archives that somebody is asexual, but it's just a headcanon for the writer that one person of this couple is asexual?
Depends on the fandom. There are certain characters that I feel like either remind asexual people of themselves or have tropes that, for better or worse, are applied to people who are asexual. So people like Sherlock, where he says he's married to his work constantly, that tends to be very common to assign as asexuality. Castiel being divine and sexless, depending on whether or not you interpret that, people say, oh yeah, that's asexuality. And that can come from someone who is asexual and being like, oh, that feels like me. It almost reminds me of, not to step out of my lane, but the concept of mermaids and trans metaphors of, this person, their fictionalism reminds me of myself, and I grab onto that. But just as easily, it could be used by someone else who just says, oh, this reminds me of some notion I have about these people that I might not know so well, so I'm just going to use it. And that doesn't always have to be negative. It doesn't always have to be positive. It can just be, that's the dialogue we have in society currently at the moment, and that's just where their brain goes. So it depends on where you look. I've seen quite a few, if you search asexuality in AO3, you get a lot of Sherlock, you get a lot of the Magnus Archives because it's canon. You get a lot of just places where you find people that exhibit certain behaviors that, for better or worse, people think of as asexual behaviors. And from there, it just depends on how they want them to interact with the people around them. And ships or not, it just kind of goes through these stages of, I think this person is asexual, well, I want to ship them with this person, and then realizing that the two aren't mutually exclusive. You just need to kind of bend your brain around the idea that the two can, in fact, live in harmony.
Wow.
I hope our listeners will forgive the fact that I go on long rambles. I'm an English major. Sorry, guys. I have many thoughts.
You are surrounded by also English majors, don't worry.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Do you have any favorite asexual characters?
John from the Magnus Archives, the archivist, because really he's the only one that I know in a published official capacity that is said in the narrative and without, he is asexual. That is what he is. And it's wonderful. He's the main character. He goes through all this stuff. His asexuality is important, but it's not the plot. It's beautiful and wonderful, and I love it. And from there, most of...
That's really rare in media, just in general,
Oh,
I would
it's
say.
super rare. It's
And not just of asexuality, but also of like anybody in the LGBTQIP spectrum. Like, if the main character is gay, then that movie is about that character being gay. It's not just them living their life and other things happen.
Yeah, exactly. But any other characters that are asexual that I love are all me going, no, that person's asexual, and grabbing them with my grubby little hands. And, it's subtext, but honestly, I don't think that's a bad thing, because if I learned one thing from my degree and all those literature classes I took, and might have failed a few times, it is that queer theory is about subtext by necessity, because so much of that was not allowed to be spoken aloud, I guess, repeating words. It was either illegal or a taboo, and it needed to be subtext and subtle and something you had to look into. So part of analyzing any kind of media is to look for subtext, and if that subtext is queer, that isn't invalid. It just shouldn't be the only way that we find ourselves in our works that we consume.
Absolutely. One of the reasons why we have this podcast is to create a platform for people to share their perspective. And I think that that's fandom as well. And we hope that we can foster a sense of being a platform for people to share who they are. What you just said reminded me of that kind of core value that we have as a podcast, I would say. Anyway.
You talked about the fact that some characters tend to just sort of naturally get folded under sort of an ace umbrella as a headcanon more than others. Do you, if anybody knows the characters of Sherlock and Castiel, like, do you see a certain connection between what kinds of characters they label as ace and perhaps people who have neurodivergencies of a certain flavor?
Yes, actually, that's a very common trope that can be quite problematic, not just for asexual people, but for people who are neurodivergent, is the idea that if you are in any way neurodivergent or interact with the world differently, clearly you must just not be interested in sex. There's a very interesting YouTuber that I actually have followed since I was very, very young, and just discovering asexuality was a thing. She goes by Swankivy. She's an author and has Letters to an Asexual as a long-running series where people will basically send her very ignorant and inappropriate things about asexuality, and she kind of, in a very funny way, breaks it down and why they're wrong, why that's very silly, and then talks about asexuality as a whole. And in there, I cannot for the life of me give you an episode, but it discusses tropes and how that gets kind of interlocked together and how that stuff can be bad or difficult. And part of that is neurodivergence. I think one of the examples, possibly not in the video, but just in my brain space, is Sheldon Cooper from Big Bang Theory, which I've never watched, but his attitude and the way he interacts with the world, which is coded as some form of neurodivergent, also lends very strongly to him being perceived as utterly sexless. And that can be a big problem, because a lot of responses asexual people receive when saying I'm asexual is, have you gone to the doctor? Or, you should go to therapy, that's not healthy, and things like that. And it's the idea that there's something inherently wrong with you if you do not feel sexual attraction the way that society deems appropriate for humanity. And in that way, it also runs the other direction of, if you do not act or think in a way that, if your brain does not function in the way that society says this is the way that is normative, you are then prescribed as either just a lack of humanity, which is tied into not having sex, or as a childishness, an infantilization that is then, of course, separated from sex and sexuality. So if someone is asexual or someone is neurodivergent or even someone that is both, these tropes kind of follow you around constantly and just kind of linger in the back of your mind and in your media, just as a nature of how we think about both sex and neurodivergence in our culture. It's tied up and complicated, and it's going to probably take a long time for us to unpick that and start to be able to see them as two separate things and be able to healthily process both of them.
God, this feels like a masterclass in like human mating psychology and like asexuality.
I am not a professor. Don't listen to a word I say. I am a fool. A jester in my own court.
But you own the court.
I'm borrowing a court, let's say. I feel like this is your guys' kingdom that I'm encroaching upon with my jingly hat.
So, in the same vein, would you consider what you just listed off as misconceptions that you tend to encounter when people interact with asexuality?
All the time. Not usually with younger people, as they tend to be at least aware asexuality exists, but when I'm discussing things with older people, with more distant family members, with even just coworkers that are several decades older than me and maybe have kids my age, it always comes up as, oh, well, have you talked to your doctor about this? Are you okay? There's always this air of like concern and worry, like I'm revealing some great harmful secret about my health or my trauma that they think I have. And it's slightly frustrating to just be like, no, I'm fine, I'm happy. I've worked very hard to become happy with this. In my younger years, there was a lot of pain tied up with just not feeling any of these attractions that I was supposed to feel according to, the world around me and the culture I was specifically born into. And it just is kind of a slap in the face almost, even though I know most people mean these, very kindly, to just say, oh, we think something is wrong with you. And that's not just painful to me, it's painful for anyone who has any sort of, neurodivergent traits, which are then said, you are something to be, that's something wrong with you, it's something bad. And I'm going to use that to try and remove something from what I consider to be a human experience, from what I can think of you as, If you have any part of yourself on the autism spectrum, you are not allowed to just be a person. You are a person with limits, with caveats. And that can very easily tie into sex and sexuality. And asexuals kind of get put under the bus in that because our relationship with that is very different from people who are allosexual. That is the inverse of asexual.
Somebody who's interested in having sex. Not that asexuals can't be interested, but...
Yeah, but it's the concept of cis versus trans. If trans is one thing, cis is the opposite or the negation of that. It's just a way to help categorize what we're talking about. So allosexuals are basically people who do not identify as asexual, just to separate that out.
Okay. Yeah, so the people who you talk to and who are older, they are always concerned for you?
Not always, of course. There are some people that, like, I have an aunt who's very cool and a rocket scientist that doesn't have anything to do with it, but I'm so impressed by her and her rocket scientry. She's been very cool and supportive. There are other people, like, really, I just think it comes down to how much exposure they have to not just the queer community, but asexual people in general. And then they kind of start to process, even if they're not 100% on it, they understand, like, okay, this is just a thing people are. And they seem to implicitly know what things they shouldn't say. But it does get tiring when my coworker is asking me about my dating life and I'm really don't want to talk about this one on the job and say, well, I'm asexual, I'm not interested in sex, and he proceeds to then stop and lecture me for a good 10 minutes about how someday I'll find a man that is nice and wonderful and I'll find someone. And I'm sitting there thinking, first of all, you assume a man. Second of all, no, I have worked so hard to become okay with the idea that I don't need to find anyone to be romantic with. I'm fine the way I am, and I'm happier for it. So it's just kind of hurtful to have people say, no, the pain you felt back then that was so damaging to your health and, you know, really, really dangerous for you is right, but you just need to try harder. It's like, no, I've put that pain behind me. Stop trying to drag it back up.
I've never really understood it when you bring forth an idea to somebody who doesn't hold the same idea, and then they lecture you about having a different idea. It's like, that idea isn't hurting you, man. We can have different ideas about things. It's just funny. I don't know. Humans are weird.
They are.
So very. Strongly implying that we are not human, which is false.
As far as the government knows. As far as any of you can prove.
Our listeners don't know. They don't know who we are.
Correct. We are, in fact, beings of pure podcast energy.
Oh, yes.
Okay. New question. That was a fascinating topic that we just talked about, but
when you do see, in the rare instances that you do see some form of ace representation, whether it be canon or headcanon in a fic, are there anything that you see that people who write it do, like, you think perhaps better or in a more interesting way than if you would write your standard allosexual relationship? Do you see anything that they do that's just, it pains your soul? Like, if you're like, this is worse, you shouldn't have done this.
Yes to both of them. So for the thoughtful fic writer who really considers, you know, how would this affect this person's relationship, whether it is romantic or just interpersonal relationships they have with the people around them, it is a consideration that, for better or worse, sex is something that is very important to a lot of people. And saying, I'm not interested in that either at all, or right now, or I have limits on what my interest is, it makes you consider and think, and it has you ponder the characterization to think, how would they discuss this in character? Because some characters would discuss it very poorly, but done well, it's a wonderful piece of character fiction. Something that is kind of agony is, on the worst end, it is the I can change him variety, you know, him being a general term, of the idea that no, they're not really ace, or that doesn't really matter, you just need to find the right person, and then you shall magically, mystically become allosexual, with no discussion of, well, you know, asexuality has a very broad spectrum. You know, there's demisexuality, where sexual attraction just does not come about until a very close interpersonal connection is established. Or there's gray sexuality, or, you know, the variation on romantic attraction, where maybe sex is off the table or limited in some way to someone's desire for it, but romance and intimacy beyond sex is still very much a part of that relationship. But just kind of throwing that all away and saying, no, this person's love or sexual organs or whatever, that'll make this person allosexual, and we just won't have to think about that. That is rage-inducing. But further than that, there are gentler ways that they can have problems of just, you know, unfortunate tropes of comparing them to something inhuman like a robot, or saying they're incomplete in some way, or, you know, it doesn't always have to be done maliciously. These tropes are common in mass media, and, you know, people just sometimes aren't educated enough, and that's not to say, you know, ignorant as a bad thing, but factually they just don't know that that is very hurtful to be dehumanized like that for something that you just don't want to do.
Quick question. So the opposite of a romantic person would be an allo-romantic?
Presumably, yes. A is the prefix for an absence of, and allo is the opposite of that, so an inclusion of.
So there isn't like a generalized term to describe somebody who is romantic? I guess romantic.
Romantic attraction is kind of a facet of the ace community, because with the absence of sexual attraction, there is more wiggle room to then consider your romantic attraction, because as far as I know, as someone who is asexual and has never experienced romantic attraction, being also aromantic, romantic and sexual attraction tends, to big asterisks on there, I know that it's not always, to walk hand in hand in the same direction. So if someone is homosexual, they are often a homo-romantic, but sometimes that's different. And asexuality, with an absence of one thing, it lends maybe a greater clarifying focus to another, of I am not interested in sex, but I'm very interested in holding hands and cuddling and even non-passionately but very romantically kissing only girls, which means I am homo-romantic if that person identifies as a woman. Or I believe that I am biromantic. I feel romantic attraction regardless of, to multiple genders. Or panromantic, gender really doesn't matter to me. I feel romantic attraction to all sorts of individuals regardless of gender identity or presentation. And that can even go to demi-romanticism, where, well, it depends on how close I am with the person. This nuance just kind of comes from, I think, with a lack of sexuality to kind of smooth over the edges, you ponder it a little deeper, and, what else are you going to do when everyone's obsessed with sex and you're not? It is something that kind of comes up to your mind a lot of, well, I'm not interested in that, but I am interested in this kind of relationship with other people. It just kind of comes up in your head and doesn't escape. So you can either ignore it or you can write long posts about it. And over on Avon, people have done both.
And be on a podcast about it.
Exactly. These are the three flavors of asexuality. It's official. As the spokesperson, I have decreed.
So, final question for this part of the two-part series that we're doing with you. Do you have any favorite ships or favorite fandoms that you like to wade into on the internet?
Regardless of how asexual they are? Because if so, many. But specific to asexuality, it's a narrow pool to fish from.
Really? Okay.
Yes. Because I'm
the Magnus Archives?
Yes, because I was never very into Super Hulock, and I never got into Sherlock or Castiel, and the stuff that I'm interested in, just, broad palette, but sometimes you just can't find that stuff, and the stuff that you do find is very rare. It's mostly headcanon. It's not a feature of the ship. Mostly it's an add-on of exploring this aspect. What if this ship, but one of the characters was asexual? Like, in Persona 5, I really like the ship, the video game Persona 5. I really like the ship of Yusuke Kitagawa, one of the party members you have in the game, and the protagonist, who is often called Akira Kurusu. I think that's very cute, and a lot of people headcanon Yusuke as being some flavor of asexual. I think that's great. That's fun and cute. So, yeah, there's one, but again, that's a headcanon. For canon stuff, it would be the Magnus Archives, because John is canonically asexual, and he is in a romantic relationship with another man. And that is all canon. That is just things that happen in the text, and it is magical and wonderful, and every time I think about it, I'm like, oh, there it is! There's us! Even though, I am aromantic, it still delights me to see an asexual character in a fulfilling and loving and beautiful relationship with another person, where it doesn't matter. It never matters that John is asexual. He's still in love. They say I love you very often, and they're just very sweet.
Do you prefer having a ship that you're reading, or I guess couple in general, both of them being asexual or some flavor of asexual or aromantic, or like one of them?
It depends on how good the fic writer is. I would gladly go for both. I would go for either or. It depends on how the fic writer's going. There are plenty of fics where John's canonical partner, his name is Martin, where he is also a flavor of asexuality. There are some where he is not. And, it depends on how they characterize him. If the writing is good, I will gladly take either or.
Gotcha.
Which is kind of my opinion on most ships and fics, is I am... as Bea labeled herself in a very early one, a multi-shipper, where really to sell me on a ship, it just needs to be well written. I have tropes that I'm very fond of, which if you look at a list of my favorite ships, you'll see very quickly what those tropes are. Shish. Everyone has their foibles, but it depends on how well written it is. And that's how you really sell me, is if it's good characterization, if the writing is good, if your prose absolutely slaps, to use a technical term, you can sell me on just about anything.
Well, thank you very much, Misssampo.
Thank you so much for having me. This is absolutely thrilling, and it's so wonderful to get to talk about this part of my life where it's really not talked about, and I'm so happy I can put it out there for all the other asexuals out there. Like, I see you, I love you, and happy Pride.
Also for the people who aren't asexual as well. I'm sure that they're learning a lot.
Oh, yes. And I love you guys too. Happy Pride. Feel free to do some research. Eat some cake in honor of your fellow asexuals.
So this is not the last time you will be hearing from our lovely Misssampo. We are in fact going to do a part 2. So in honor of that, we are actually going to make you wait for a rec corner because we want you to listen to part 2 of this.
We have some good recs, I promise.
We do, we really do. All 3 of us have good recs with good asexual representation. So that's it.
So I guess we'll see y'all next week.
On Fangirls Anonymous. Bye!
Bye-bye!